All right, if you're listening to this, you're probably knee-deep in your diploma, master's, or even PhD thesis, right? And I bet you're looking at all that data and thinking, how in the world am I going to make sense of all of this?
It can definitely feel like a mountain of data, that's for sure. But don't worry, we're here to help.
That's right. This deep dive is all about making statistical analysis feel a little less intimidating, a little less like staring into the abyss. We're going to unpack the essentials of StatExpert.pro. It's a resource that's been a lifesaver for me personally. I mean, think about it. Picking the right sampling method, designing a questionnaire that actually gets you useful data, and then, oh boy, online surveys.
It seems like everyone and their dog is doing online surveys these days.
I know, right? Are they really all they're cracked up to be? But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind to the basics. StatExpert kicks things off by talking about qualitative versus quantitative research, but I always get those two mixed up.
Yeah, those terms can sound a bit jargony. Think of it this way. Qualitative research is like having a really in-depth conversation with someone to understand their unique experiences and perspectives. Quantitative research, on the other hand, is more about collecting data from a bigger group of people and then using those numbers to find patterns and trends.
So qualitative is all about depth, and quantitative is all about breadth.
You got it. And here's the thing. StatExpert actually points out that qualitative research can be super powerful when you're dealing with more complex topics like memory or behavior. It allows you to dig into the nitty-gritty details that you might miss if you're just crunching numbers.
That makes a lot of sense, especially for a thesis where you're often exploring uncharted territory. You need those rich details to really get a grasp of what's going on.
Exactly. Sometimes you need to go beyond the numbers to really get the full picture.
Okay, so let's say we've figured out our research approach. Now we need to decide who we're actually going to study, which brings us to the wonderful world of sampling. StatExpert dives into probability and non-probability sampling, and I have to admit, those terms always make my head spin a little bit. Can we break those down?
Of course. Let's imagine you want to know what students across the entire country think about a new education policy. With probability sampling, every single student has an equal chance of being selected for your study.
Okay, so it's totally random, like drawing names out of a hat.
Exactly. But what if you only surveyed students at your own university? That would be non-probability sampling because you're not giving everyone an equal chance. You're focusing on a specific, convenient group.
Got it. So probability sampling is the gold standard for getting a representative sample of a larger population, but I can imagine it can be a logistical nightmare, especially for a thesis student with limited time and resources.
You're telling me. That's why StatExpert really stresses the importance of thinking carefully about your sample size and how it relates to the larger population you're interested in.
So even if I can't survey every single student in the country, I can still get meaningful results if my sample is well-designed and accurately reflects the characteristics of the larger student population.
Exactly. You've got it.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Even with the most careful sampling, there will always be some level of deviation. It's like trying to recreate a complex recipe from just a tiny taste. You can get pretty close, but there might be some subtle differences.
Okay, that's a great analogy. It highlights how important it is to acknowledge that there will be deviations and not to overgeneralize our findings.
Absolutely.
Speaking of potential pitfalls, let's talk about questionnaire design. StatExpert seems to be pretty passionate about this.
They are, and for good reason. The way you word your questions can seriously influence the answers you get. They even cite some fascinating experiments that show how seemingly small changes in wording can lead to wildly different responses.
That's so interesting. I've always struggled with writing survey questions that don't accidentally push people toward a particular answer. What are some common mistakes that we should all watch out for?
Well, a big one is using leading questions. Questions that already embed an assumption or an opinion, like instead of asking, "Don't you think online learning is more effective?" you could say, "What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of online learning?"
I see. So it's about keeping those questions neutral and letting the participants' responses speak for themselves.
Exactly.
So what about different types of questions, like open-ended versus closed-ended questions?
Yeah, good question. StatExpert goes into that too, outlining the pros and cons of each. Open-ended questions give people the freedom to really express themselves in their own words, which can be super valuable, but it can also make analysis more challenging.
Especially if you have like hundreds of responses to go through. So I'm guessing closed-ended questions are easier to analyze because you're giving people specific answer choices to pick from.
Exactly. Think of it like multiple choice versus an essay question. They both have their place. And the best approach often depends on what you're trying to learn and how much time you have to analyze the data.
Right. It's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
It sounds like StatExpert is really all about giving researchers the tools to make smart decisions about their research design. And speaking of tools, let's talk about those online surveys. StatExpert seems to be a fan, but they also admit that they're not without their challenges.
Yeah, online surveys are super convenient, they're cost effective, you can reach a huge audience, and the data collection is often automated, which is great. But the trade-off is that you lose some of the control you have with more traditional methods.
Like what kind of control?
Well, for one, it can be harder to be absolutely sure that people online are really who they say they are, and you don't have the chance to clear up any confusion someone might have while they're taking the survey.
That's a good point. And let's be real, it's way easier to ignore an online survey than it is to tell someone face-to-face that you're not interested.
Totally.
What other online survey methods does StatExpert talk about?
Well, they actually cover quite a few. Telephone surveys, postal surveys, and even personal interviews, but conducted online. So there's definitely a range of options.
So it's not just about clicking through a web form. There are different ways to approach online surveys, and the best way really depends on your research questions and the kind of data you need. What's interesting is that StatExpert.pro actually offers tools and guidings for building and running online surveys too.
That's right. They walk you through the process, which can be really helpful, especially if online research is new territory for you.
Sounds like they're trying to make things as straightforward as possible.
Yeah, definitely.
It seems like StatExpert is really trying to demystify this whole data analysis thing for thesis students, which is so needed. Now let's dig a little deeper into one of the key areas of analysis: bivariate statistical tests. What are we actually testing here?
So bivariate analysis is all about exploring the relationship between two variables. For example, how does age relate to income? Or, in the context of your thesis, maybe how exposure to a particular environmental factor affects disease risk.
Okay, so we're looking for patterns and connections between different factors. But how do we know if those connections are actually meaningful, statistically speaking?
That's where statistical significance comes in. It basically helps us figure out whether the relationship we're seeing in our sample data is likely to hold true for the bigger population, too. It's like a measure of how confident we can be in the findings. But StatExpert warns against just chasing statistical significance without thinking about what it really means.
So just because something is statistically significant doesn't mean it's actually important or relevant in the real world.
Exactly. It's like finding a statistically significant correlation between shoe size and IQ. Sure, there might be a tiny measurable connection there, but it doesn't mean big feet make you smarter. Context matters.
I love that example. It reminds me that statistics are just a tool, not some kind of magic wand.
Right.
We have to use our own judgment and critical thinking to understand what the results really mean for our research.
Exactly.
And that's what makes thesis research so exciting, right?
Yeah.
It's a blend of rigorous analysis and thoughtful interpretation.
Absolutely. It's all about uncovering those meaningful insights and adding to our understanding of the world. And that's what makes doing a thesis so rewarding. You get to dive deep into a topic and really contribute to the body of knowledge.
It feels like StatExpert is a great companion on that journey. Speaking of which, let's get into the weeds a bit with those sampling techniques we were talking about. What are some of the options out there for, someone working on their thesis?
Okay, so remember probability sampling. Well, imagine you're studying the effectiveness of a new teaching method across different universities. With simple random sampling, every single student at each university has an equal chance of ending up in your study.
That seems super fair, but also logistically kind of crazy if you're dealing with thousands of students. Are there any shortcuts or workarounds?
There are. StatExpert talks about this thing called stratified sampling. It's kind of like creating mini versions of the whole population within your sample. You could divide the students up, maybe by their major or what year they're in, or even by the type of university they attend. Then you randomly pick students from each of those mini groups to make sure your sample accurately reflects the entire student population.
So you're making sure you get a nice blend of different perspectives and experiences within your sample. Makes sense. What about non-probability sampling? What does that look like in the real world?
Well, convenience sampling is a popular one, especially for thesis research because it's, convenient. It might involve surveying your classmates or using data that's already available at your university.
I can see why that would be tempting, especially when you're short on time. But StatExpert also warns about the limitations of that, right?
Oh, absolutely. They're big on emphasizing that. Like, if you only survey your classmates, Your findings might not apply to students in other departments or at other schools. You have to be really careful not to make sweeping generalizations that go beyond the scope of your data.
Right. It's like judging a whole pizza based on a single slice. You might get a taste of the overall flavor, but you could be missing out on some crucial ingredients.
You got it. And StatExpert gives this interesting real-world example to drive that point home. They talk about quota sampling, which is another type of non-probability sampling. Let's say you're researching what consumers think about a new smartphone app, and you want to make sure your sample includes a certain number of men and women from different age groups. With quota sampling, you might set those targets and then just recruit the first people you find who fit the criteria.
That sounds pretty efficient, but I feel like there has to be a downside to that approach.
You're right. The big difference between quota sampling and stratified sampling is randomness. Remember how in stratified sampling you randomly select people from each subgroup? Well, with quota sampling, you might end up with bias if the people you find first aren't really representative of everyone in that quota. It's like, imagine if you were standing outside a tech store and only asking the first 20 men and 20 women you saw about their app preferences.
I see what you mean. Those first 40 people might not actually represent the huge variety of smartphone users out there.
Exactly. So even though quota sampling might seem like a quicker and easier option, it's really important to be aware of its limitations and the potential for bias creeping in.
So the bottom line is that choosing the right sampling technique comes down to your research goals, how much time and resources you have, and how important it is for your findings to apply to a larger group. It's a bit of a balancing act, isn't it?
It really is. And speaking of balancing acts, let's shift gears and talk about the fine art of questionnaire design. StatExpert really makes the point that even the most brilliant research can be totally undermined by poorly written questions.
You know, I've taken my fair share of surveys where the questions were just so confusing or awkward. It really makes you question how reliable the results can be. What are some of StatExpert's top tips for crafting really solid survey questions?
Well, they're all about keeping things clear, concise, and avoiding jargon or technical terms that your participants might not get. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to understand what you're asking and to give you useful answers.
It seems obvious, but I bet it's easy to forget that when you're so focused on your own research.
Totally. And another thing they highlight is the importance of avoiding bias in your questions.
Oh, you mean like those sneaky questions that try to subtly lead people toward a certain answer? Those are so annoying.
Exactly. StatExpert gives some great examples of those kinds of leading questions to watch out for and suggests ways to rephrase them to be more neutral. For example, instead of asking, "Don't you agree that social media is addictive?" you could ask, "What are your thoughts on the potential impact of social media on daily life?"
Ah, I see the difference. It's about giving people space to share their honest opinions without feeling pressured to agree with a certain viewpoint.
Exactly. The goal is to collect accurate and reliable data, not to try and manipulate people's responses.
Right, it makes sense. Are there any other common mistakes that StatExpert warns against?
They also emphasize the importance of thinking about all the possible answers someone might give, even if they don't fit neatly into the categories you've already set up. Like if you're asking people about their favorite music genres, it's always good to include an other option with a space for them to write in something that's not on your list.
That's a great point. You don't want to force people into boxes that don't really represent their experiences or preferences.
Exactly. And this is super important when you're asking about sensitive or personal topics where people might feel uncomfortable choosing from a limited set of options. You want to make sure everyone feels like their voice can be heard.
So it sounds like the art of questionnaire design is all about finding the right balance between structure and flexibility. You want to guide people through the survey, but also give them the freedom to express themselves authentically.
You nailed it. And speaking of balancing acts, let's move on to the ever-popular world of online surveys, where convenience and control often clash.
Online surveys are everywhere these days. They're so easy to use. But I also wonder if we lose something when we move away from those face-to-face interactions and rely on digital forms. What's StatExpert's take on that?
They definitely acknowledge that online surveys have been a game changer for collecting data. You know, they're fast, they're cost-effective, and you can reach people all over the place. But they also make it clear that there are unique challenges with online surveys that you have to be aware of.
Okay, like what? I'm curious to hear their perspective.
For one thing, it's harder to be totally sure about the identity of your participants online. You know, are they really who they say they are? And you don't have the same level of control over the environment that you would with a paper survey or an interview.
Oh, right. So you can't be sure that people are really focusing on the survey and not like scrolling through their phone or checking other stuff on their computer at the same time.
Exactly. And then there's the age-old problem of low response rates, which can be a real pain with online surveys.
Yeah, it's so easy to just close that tab
Hmm.
or ignore that email sitting in your inbox.
Totally. So StatExpert suggests a few ways to try to boost participation. They talk about being really clear and engaging in your communication, sending reminder emails, and even offering a small incentive to encourage people to take the time to fill out your survey.
It's almost like you have to market your survey to your participants, like you're trying to sell them something.
In a way, yeah. You want to make it clear to them that their time and input are valuable and that their answers are going to be used to make a difference.
I can see that. Okay, what about the actual design of the online survey itself? Any specific tips from State Expert there?
They really emphasize the importance of making the survey as user-friendly as possible. Keep it short and focused, use clear and consistent formatting, and make sure it looks good on a phone so people can take it on the go.
It sounds like it's all about reducing those little points of friction and making the experience as smooth and enjoyable as possible.
Exactly. Oh, and don't forget about data security. StatExpert is very clear about choosing a survey platform that's reputable and takes data protection seriously, especially if you're collecting sensitive information.
That's so important. You definitely don't want to compromise your participants' privacy or put your research at risk.
Totally agree. And just like with any research method, online surveys have their pros and cons. It's all about using the right tool for the job and being aware of the potential pitfalls.
So even though they're super convenient, they're not a magic solution. You still have to be thoughtful about the design, how you communicate with your participants, and how you're going to keep their data safe.
Absolutely. And that's another area where StatExpert's advice really comes in handy. They give you all these practical tips and resources to help you navigate the world of online surveys and do really solid ethical research.
It seems like they're all about empowering researchers to make good choices and produce high-quality work no matter what methods they're using.
Yeah, that's definitely their vibe.
Okay, so we've talked about sampling, questionnaire design, online surveys, and I think we're ready to tackle the analysis side of things. We've collected all this data. Now what? How do we make sense of it all?
Okay, this is where those bivariate statistical tests we keep mentioning really come into play. Remember, bivariate analysis is all about looking at the relationship between two variables.
Right, so we might be interested in things like how sleep quality affects academic performance, how exercise relates to stress levels, or how social media use impacts self-esteem. There are so many possibilities.
Tons. And StatExpert lays out this really helpful way of figuring out which statistical test is the right one based on the type of variables you're working with. So let's say you're comparing the average exam scores of two groups of students. Maybe one group used a new study techniques and the other didn't. You might use a t-test to see if there's a difference.
The t-test tells us whether that difference in average scores is statistically significant, right?
Exactly. It helps us determine if the difference we see is likely due to chance or if it's a real difference between the two groups.
So if the t-test shows a statistically significant difference, we can be more confident that the new study technique actually had a positive effect on those exam scores.
You got it. Okay, now imagine you're interested in looking at the relationship between two continuous variables, like hours of sleep and GPA. For that, you might use a correlation analysis.
So correlation analysis would tell us if there's a pattern, like do students who get more sleep tend to have higher GPAs?
Exactly. It measures how strong the relationship is between those two variables and also tells you the direction of the relationship.
So a positive correlation means that as one variable goes up, the other one tends to go up too, right?
Yep. And a negative correlation means that as one variable increases, the other one tends to decrease. For example, you might find a negative correlation between how much time someone spends looking at screens before bed and how well they sleep.
Right. That makes sense. The more screen time, the harder it might be to fall asleep and get a good night's rest.
Exactly. And those are just a couple of examples. StatExpert goes into a bunch of other tests too, like chi-square tests for looking at relationships between categorical variables, things like gender and opinions on a certain issue, and ANOVA tests for comparing the means of more than two groups.
There are so many different statistical tools to help us make sense of our data. But with all these options, it can be tough to know which test to use for your specific research question.
Definitely. But that's where StatExpert really shines. They explain each test in a clear way, give examples, and offer guidelines to help you pick the best one based on your research design and the kind of data you have.
It sounds like they've thought of everything. It's like having a statistics guru in your back pocket.
I like that. And it's important to remember that even with the most sophisticated statistical analysis, it's all about interpreting your results in a way that makes sense.
So even if something is statistically significant, it doesn't necessarily mean it has practical implications in the real world, right? We talked about that a bit earlier.
Exactly. A statistically significant finding might not be that meaningful if your sample size is small, or if it doesn't really represent the bigger population you're interested in. And even if it is both statistically and practically significant, you still have to consider all the other factors that could be at play. It's about using your judgment and being a critical thinker to really understand what the data is telling you.
It's like being a detective, piecing together all the clues and trying to build a solid case based on the evidence.
Love that analogy. And that brings us to another crucial point that State Expert emphasizes: the difference between your sample and the larger population you're trying to understand.
Oh, yeah. I remember feeling so lost with that concept in my stats class. It was like trying to make conclusions about the entire universe based on a tiny little speck of dust. How can we be sure that what we're seeing in our sample is actually happening in the bigger picture?
That's the big question. And StatExpert gives you some really helpful ways to approach it. They point out that you can only generalize your findings from your sample to the larger population if certain statistical conditions are met.
So our sample needs to be like a mini-me version of the whole population, right? Like we talked about with sampling techniques. If the sample isn't representative, our findings might not apply to the broader group.
Exactly. And the statistical tests we use are designed to help us figure out if the patterns we're seeing in our sample are likely to hold true for that larger population. For example, if we find a statistically significant relationship between two variables in our sample data, it suggests there's a good chance that relationship exists in the real world too.
It's like tasting a spoonful of soup and trying to decide if you like the whole pot, right? If that one spoonful is amazing, there's a good chance the rest of the soup is too. But if it's bland, you might want to try a few more bites before you decide you don't like it.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, even if the whole pot seems delicious based on a few spoonfuls, there's always a chance you might hit a weird ingredient or two lurking down at the bottom.
So it's all about being cautious and not jumping to conclusions based on just a small piece of the puzzle. We need to acknowledge the limitations of our sample and be open to the possibility that there's some variation out there in the wider world.
Absolutely. Statistical analysis is super powerful, but it's not a magic crystal ball. It gives us insights and probabilities, not absolute guarantees.
It's about using data to tell a compelling story, but also being honest about the uncertainties and limitations that come with the research process.
Exactly. And remember, doing a thesis is all about exploring and discovering new things. It's about asking questions, testing out ideas, and adding to our understanding of the world, even if that means hitting a few bumps in the road along the way.
It's about pushing the boundaries of what we know and embracing the challenges that come with doing rigorous research, and that's what makes it so exciting. Now, we've talked a lot about statistical tests and interpreting results, but I'm curious, what are some of the most common mistakes thesis students make when it comes to data analysis? And what can they do to avoid those pitfalls?
That's a really good question, and actually StatExpert spends some time talking about common mistakes that people make. One of the biggest ones is getting so hung up on statistical significance that you forget to think about the bigger picture.
Right, like we were saying earlier, just because something is statistically significant doesn't automatically mean it's important or that it really matters in the real world.
Exactly. Another easy mistake is to misinterpret the results of statistical tests, especially when you're talking about correlation versus causation.
The classic correlation doesn't equal causation trap. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. There could be other things going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. State Expert actually uses this funny example to show how that works. They talk about this study that found a strong correlation between how much ice cream people buy and the crime rate. But obviously, that doesn't mean eating ice cream makes people commit crimes.
Right, there's probably something else going on, like maybe it's just hotter outside, which would explain why both ice cream sales and crime rates go up.
Exactly. So you always have to be really careful about jumping to conclusions about cause and effect just because you see a correlation. State Expert also talks about the importance of understanding the assumptions behind the statistical tests you're using.
Oh, right, we talked about that a bit before. Certain tests kind of assume that your data has certain characteristics, like being normally distributed.
Right. And if those assumptions aren't met, the results of the test might not be reliable. So StatExpert encourages students to really look closely at their data And maybe even talk to a statistician if they're not sure if a particular test is a good fit.
So it's all about knowing the limitations of statistical analysis and not just blindly trusting the numbers that come out.
Yeah,
You have to understand what's going on under the hood and be able to look at the results critically.
absolutely. And that brings us back to one of the core messages of this whole deep dive. Statistical analysis can be incredibly powerful, but it works best when you use it in a thoughtful way, combined with solid research practices and a clear understanding of what you're actually trying to find out.
It's not about just plugging numbers into a formula. It's about using those numbers to tell a meaningful story about your research.
Exactly. And that's what StatExpert is all about. They want to give you the tools and the knowledge to tell that story effectively.
So for all those thesis writers out there who are feeling overwhelmed by data analysis, remember, you're not alone. StatExpert.pro is like this amazing resource that can help you break down those statistical barriers and make sense of all those numbers.
They really do a great job of explaining things clearly, giving practical advice, and even offering software to help you along the way.
And they remind us that statistical analysis isn't just about crunching numbers. It's about discovering things, answering those burning research questions, and ultimately contributing something new to your field of study.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, embrace the challenge, don't be afraid to ask for help, and remember that writing a thesis is a journey of discovery. And just like any adventure, it's more fun when you have the right tools and the right people by your side.
And StatExpert.pro might just be the perfect companion for this statistical adventure. It's like having that wise and experienced mentor cheering you on every step of the way.
Couldn't agree more.
So to all our listeners, go forth and analyze. And remember, you've got this.
Happy analyzing.